Amendment 17. Popular election of senators. Passed by Congress May 13th, 1912, ratified April 8th, 1913. The 17th Amendment changed a portion of Article 1, Section 3. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof, for 6 years, and each senator will have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualification requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority for such state shall issue rates of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election, as the legislature may direct. This amendment shall not be so construed any senator chosen before it becomes valid as a part of the Constitution. Common interpretation. The 17th Amendment by David S. Schlager and Todd G. Zwicky. While many constitutional amendments ended the rights held by Americans, changed the balance of power between the federal government and states, or altered elections for the president, the structure for Congress in the written Constitution has barely been touched since 1791. The only constitutional amendment to do so in a substantial way is the 17th Amendment, which removed from state legislature the power to choose U.S. senators and give them power directly to voters in each state. According to James Madison, giving state legislature the power to choose senators provided a double advantage, both favoring a select appointment and for giving the state governments such an agency in the formation of the federal government as must secure the authority of the former. Federalist number 62. George Mason argued that the state legislative selection gives states the power for self-defense against the federal government. Wendell Pierce argued that the contrast between a state legislative appointed Senate and a popular elective House would increase the type's interests representing the federal government. By requiring the consent of 2 different constituencies to end legislation, the people representatives in the House and the state legislatures in the Senate, the composition of the Senate was seen as essential to the system for bicameralism, which would require the concurrence of 2 distinct bodies in schemes for usurpation or perfidy. Whether state legislative appointment was included in the Constitution to protect state governments, though, is a matter for some dispute. Contemporary legal scholar Terry Smith argues that it was merely the result of an intersection of 2 other goals: the Great Compromise giving states equally weighted votes in the Senate, and desire to limit popular representation. Either way, the legislatures were not given other powers that might have allowed them to more directly control senators, like the power to recall senators or to instruct them on how to vote. As a result, scholars like William Riker and Larry Kramer had argued that the state legislature exert little control over senators at any point, although more recent works like Todd Zwicky has argued that this is overblown and the state legislative control did have a substantial effect on the way the Senate operated. However, starting in roughly the 1830s, and then more dramatically after the Civil War, the vision found their hand in which state legislatures would deliberate over the selection of senators began to fray. First, politicians seeking Senate seats began campaigning for state legislative candidates in a process known as the public canvass. The result was that the state legislative races became secondary to Senate races. The most famous instance of this was the race for Senate in Illinois in 1858, in which Abraham Lincoln faced off with Stephen Douglas despite neither being on the ballot. In 1890s, many states started holding direct primary for Senate, reducing the degree of influence state legislature have over the selection. Some states went further and began using something known as the Oregon system, under which state legislative candidates were required to state on the ballot whether they could abide by the result of a formally non-binding direct election for U.S. Senator. By 1908, 28 of the 45 states used the Oregon system or some other form of direct elections. The push for the 17th Amendment occurred both in state legislatures and the House of Representatives. Between 1890 and 1905, 31 state legislatures passed resolutions either calling on Congress to pass an amendment providing for the direct election of senators, to hold a conference with other states to work on such amendment, or to have constitutional conventions such that the direct elections for senators could be included in newly drawn constitution. Amendments to the Constitution providing for direct elections passed House in each session between 1893 and 1912. But several influential senators managed to hold off the amendment for more than 2 decades. The effort was aided by a decision to link the amendment to a controversial effort to remove from Congress the power to pass rules governing federal elections under the Elections Clause of Article 1. Eventually, though, the issues were split and it passed both houses in 1912 and was ratified by the states in 1913. The argument for the 17th Amendment sounded in the case for direct democracy. The problem for hung states legislature and freeing the Senate from the influence of corrupt state legislatures. The progressive movement that pushed the 17th Amendment supported other constitutional changes at the federal, state, and local levels, like initiative and referendum, nonpartisan elections, and unicameral legislatures, although there has never been a major effort to provide for democratic election of federal judges. The 17th Amendment was seen as part of a broader effort to make an end run around the control that parties, machines, and special interests and over state legislature. Ironically, however, the big city party machines supported the 17th Amendment, largely because state legislative appointment give a greater representation to rural areas due to districting decisions in the absence of a one person, one vote, and because machine-controlled cities could more easily mobilize voters. Many big special interests supported it as well. William Randolph Hearst famously hired muckraking journalist David Graham Phillips to write Expose, the Treason of the Senate, which played a major role in debates around the 17th Amendment. The popular perception that the Senate seats could be bought in back rooms of state legislature fueled support for direct elections. Further, several state seats remained open for years when state legislature could not agree on a choice. Although the importance is somewhat questionable and was attributable to a federal statute that required the senator to be elected by a majority of state legislators, not a popularity. In state legislatures, a requirement that nobody was not included for popular elections in the 17th Amendment. Further supporters for the amendment argued that the races for Senate swamped the interest in seeing issues in state legislative races, reducing the accountability of state legislature on any issue other than the identity of the senators. By the time the 17th Amendment finally passed, it was wildly popular. In recent years, however, the 17th Amendment had come under some criticism from conservatives like Justice Antonin Scalia, columnist George Will, and a host of Republicans in Congress for removing an important power from state legislatures. Further implications of the amendment, particularly its effect on appointments following vacancies, have become the subject of some dispute. But despite this, the change wrought by the 17th Amendment seems quite secure and remains the only major change to the structure of Congress. matters debate. The first perspective. The original Senate and the 17th Amendment by Todd G. Zwicky. The election of U.S. senators by state legislatures were essential to the original constitutional structure, and the adoption of the 17th Amendment in 1913 dramatically changed the constitutional structure in a fashion that is little appreciated. As institutional matter, election of senator by state legislatures was intended to further two of the essential functions of the original constitutional design: federalism and bicameralism. The most prominent function of the election senator by state legislature was to promote federalism, both by providing the states with the ability to avoid being swallowed up by the federal government, but also to serve as a convenient link between the two systems. The firm's logic is compelling. By giving state legislatures in their corporate identities ability to block federal laws and overreach, the Senate theoretically could preserve the power of the states against the national government. The most effective way to do this would be the Senate to be elected by state legislatures, thereby aligning their self-interest with the protection of the state legislature powers. Moreover, because the role played by the Senate in confirmation of the federal judges and executive branch officials, senators elected by state legislatures might be expected to be more cognizant of the positions of appointees on matters of federal-state relations. In light of the subsequent controversies regarding the Senate that eventually culminated in the adoption of the 17th Amendment, it's interesting to note that the proposal gained almost universal support at the Constitutional Convention as little debated and the convention. The election of senators by state legislatures was also essential to the design of bicameralism, that is, dividing the legislature into two distinct bodies. The goal of bicameralism, along with the other elements of the separation of powers, such as the tripartite constitutional structure, was to preserve individual liberty and frustrate the ability of interest groups for all factions to divert the powers of the federal government to promote the private interests. This concern about liberty encroaching on the special interests responding legislation was especially acute among the framers of the Constitution, who believed that state legislatures under the Articles of Confederation were overtly prone to these vices. By requiring the concurrence versus the majority of the people and then of a majority of the states, James Madison thought that bicameralism would provide greater protection against improper acts of legislation and unicameral legislature or two horses drawn from similar constituencies. In addition to this institutional role, the Senate was also expected to play an anti-democratic function under the Constitution, serving as a sort of American House of Lords composed of men of substantial accomplishment, judgment, and independence, who would be above the rough and tumble of democratic politics. This assumption accounts for many of the unique functions of the Senate that are not shared with the House, such as the power to advise and consent on appointments, to ratify treaties, or to try impeachments. Historian C.H. Habeke has argued, however, that this project was doomed for failure from the outset, as the legislature's notorious hotbeds for populism provide unlikely source for sober elections. The Senate's effectiveness in fulfilling these functions may have been less robust in practice than the framers anticipated, especially in light of the anticipated evolution of national political parties, seeing David Schlesinger, the liberal case for the 17th Amendment. Still, the constitutional and political history of post-17th Amendment America, especially in terms of federalism, is dramatically different from what came before. It is difficult to believe that the election senator by state legislatures, however attenuated, did not play some role in that. To be sure, any effects of the 17th Amendment must also be considered in combination with the 16th Amendment, which permitted a federal income tax, although it is difficult to isolate the effect of the 17th Amendment. Intuition suggests that it's a different pattern in the growth of federal government in the 20th century versus the pattern in the prior century is attributable, at least in part, to the passage of the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment also radically changed the structure for bicameralism by increasing the degree of similarity between the constituencies of the House and the Senate, although senators are still elected in statewide elections with large constituencies. Both bodies represent about the people directly, thus eliminating the check of requiring different constituencies to consent to any laws. This change would be expected to increase the power of a special interest influence over the federal government. It can be difficult to test this particular hypothesis. Still, reasonable minds could conclude that the federal government in the 20th or 21st centuries have been more engaged in redistribution schemes designed to reward particular special interests than in prior eras. Despite its essential role in the original constitutional structure and the historical matter, the overall records of the original Senate in executing its constitutional functions are somewhat mixed. The framers believed that the original Senate would be both a necessary and sufficient protection for the states against the federal government and important check against interest groups. In this sense, the lasting testament of the original Senate is to identify the challenge of designing constitutional structures, and that it can be sustained over the long run, especially in response to unanticipated events such as the rise of political parties and democratic forces. The other perspective, the liberal case for the 17th Amendment by David H. and Scaliger. Scaliger. While most discussions of the causes of the 17th Amendment focus on issues like the effect of corruption in state legislature and the progressive embrace of mass democracy and the like, they underplay the importance of federalism. Proponents of the amendment argue that removing from state legislature the power to choose U.S. senators would make state democracy work better, allowing voters to focus on state issues when choosing state officials. When the 17th Amendment is discussed today, however, this issue is largely ignored. This historical forgetting has led modern conservative critics to misunderstand the effect of senatorial elections appointment on state governments and the operation of our federal system. Figures like Justice Anthony Scalia, the Senator Mike Lee have criticized the 17th Amendment because it removed power through which state governments could control the federal government. That is to say, they criticize the 17th Amendment for harming states and state governments. In my work, as my work has shown, this is almost completely backwards. Require state legislators to choose senators, made state legislative elections simply into proxies for choosing senators, unless one takes a purely formal view, a rule that renders state elections useless as a means of creating representation, accountability for state officials to be seen as a ban for the values of federalism. Rather than harming our federalism, the 17th Amendment should be seen as an essential piece of the protections of the Constitution provides for states as political entities, alongside the guarantee clause of Article 4 and the 10th and the 11th Amendments. Notably, support for the 17th Amendment did not originate from national politicians. Instead, state legislatures and state voters in referenda forced consideration of the amendment against opposition in Congress, both through reforms like the Oregon system direct calls for an amendment or for a constitutional convention. It is not hard to see why. For instance, in deciding whom to vote for in state legislative races in 1858, voters in Illinois hand-on considered the weighty subjects of union and slavery because they were really choosing between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, rather than allowing them to make that choice separately from trying to hold state senators responsible for the performance of state government. The pre-17th Amendment Constitution forced them to win this decision together. As a result, state issues became barely a passing interest in elections for state legislatures. The effect of a senatorial appointment on state legislative elections was a major issue debates over the 17th Amendment. For instance, Senator John Hippo Michaud of Oregon argued another wild objection to the choosing of senators by the legislatures is found in the fact that in the election of the candidates for the legislature whose business it is to choose a senator, every consideration of the law side of except as how the candidates, if elected, will vote on the question of senatorship. Senator John Palmer of Illinois echoed this. Now, whatever may be the wants or the necessity of the people of the Senate, the states with respect to local legislation, the legislators are elected with reference to the vote they will cast for senator, and thus these duties are made to conflict, and the national interests, the party interests, are so overwhelming in comparison with those of the people of the states of the local interests. George Himes, the leading scholar of the time on the issue, made clear that the effects of senatorial appointment on the state legislative races was a central issue in the case for the amendment. Despite the 17th Amendment, state legislative races still turn largely on national issues, particularly the popularity of the president. Most voters do not know much about the state legislators or state legislatures, and use national party endorsement is the candidates a Democrat or Republican as heuristic when voting in state races, even if you don't know much about the stances of parties on state issues or even which party is in power. In the parlance of political scientists, state legislative elections are largely second order, or turn on the performance of core partisans and other levels of government, especially the federal government. That doesn't suggest that we need to repeal the 17th Amendment, but rather that we need new tools to further its ambition to make state elections provide accountability and representation for city voters on city issues and government performance. The 17th Amendment turned out to be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for making city democracy work well. Repealing it, however, would be a disaster for state democracy.